another week has ended, and at the same time, technically, when a week ends, a new one begins. So what we're doing for today is recapping what just happened in this latest week in this was the second week of the season. I guess the full release of the season, with Mythic Plus open as well as Mythic Raid being open. Going in order of seniority, since this was the oldest video we had, was the recap about the raid. What's been going down in the raid in this past reset. Besides, of course, the race to world first ending, with Liquid being the victors, Echo taking second, and Method taking third. Let's look more about, the actual player base, the 99.99% remaining of the players. Now we continue to have screeching players complaining about the situation at the top of the results when it comes to damage done, because Fire Mage continues to remain at the top of the overall damage done, despite the fact that, of course, when you go and check how many people actually are playing Fire, you have very, very few. In fact, less than a tenth of the Arcane Mage players are the ones playing Fire, yet their performance right now is apparently, that's what the game is telling us in these bosses, is doing very well. And you could say, well, but it's one of those cases where a spec randomly appears at the top because they are padding on AoE damage, which has happened before, right? Every tier, there's gonna be 2 or 3 fights where certain AoE specs just go ham on the meters and they show up quite high for a bit. Well, in the case of Mage, Olgrax does have quite a good amount of AoE, and Fire is not first. You also have Bloodbound Horror, which does have AoE damage. Fire Mage is in third. You have Sikran. This is important because Sikran is pure single target. There is no AoE cheating on Sikran. And then finally you have Rashanan with more ads spawning. Fire Mage is third. And then you have Brood Twister. Yes, we are talking about practically 20 logs or so, but on Brood Twister, Fire Mage is also amongst the highest performing ranged specs. So there seems to be no cheese here. Fire Mage doesn't seem to be cheating to get this kind of damage. Of course, in popularity they will always be low, because right now everyone is playing Arcane, but in terms of results with this build, which also finally, I guess, for many players, abandons Sun King's Blessings, abandon the hard cast Pyroblast playstyle. Instead, you go with improved Combustion, you go with Unleashed Inferno for even more CDR in your Combustion. You have a lot of insta-cast ability, the free procs of your Scorch, the very high regeneration rate of both of your Fire Blast and of your Phoenix Flames practically allows you to cast almost no spells in your rotation as a Fire Mage when you're fighting. If you look at any of these results, let's also focus, for example, on a single target fight like Sikran, where Fire was actually pumping a lot in this fight, and you can see the way the playstyle of Fire has changed. Of course, you are players with above room temperature IQ, so you don't have to wonder what are these spikes of damage for a Fire Mage, right? Surely you don't have to be told, right? Surely you guessed yourself that those spikes of damage are the combustion, surely. But when you look at the casts, for example, this is instant, this is instant, this is instant, this is instant. Where's the hard cast Fireball? The few times you even bother to, 4 casts, right? So it's actually a pretty nice and satisfying rotation to pull off, and it's doing quite well as well, despite not being very popular at the moment. We have gotten last week, which we said we would look over to see any possible changes. We have gotten some balance tuning to the DPS, right? These were the class notes for the reset, the 25th of September, which included the AoE buffs to Fire Mage, sure, which has helped this damage, but also the buff given to Shadow Priest, as well as AoE buff given to Beast Mastery when it comes to DPS, as well as Frost Mage. So what we can see from the results here, not really much about Frost Mage, and still nothing about Shadow Priest as well. Pretty much no real movement in there for these specs. You might try to look at the glass half full by looking at the pure single target damage. In there, Shadow Priest is doing slightly better than the weaknesses they have in AoE, but overall it's still not looking too good. It's one of those specs that has resigned itself at this point to either get an overhaul in 11.0.5 in the anniversary patch or straight up in the next season. Right now it looks relatively lost and hopeless. Even in the play rate is not, you know, particularly exciting right now when it comes to Shadow Priest. So it's not really looking too exciting for them either. There is another class that has 2 specs doing very well right now, possibly even 3, because yes, there is Mage, but there is also DK, and there is also Shaman. Not at the moment to the level of Mage, but if there is one thing that can kind of redeem these 2 other classes, especially Shaman, is that both specs are being played. It's not that there's one here and one here, like Fire and Arcane. Both of them are quite viable. Actually, just, you know, more than viable at the moment. So these are your current results when it comes to the DPS, the outliers being Frost Mage and Arcane Mage for overall picks. If you had to be very specific about just the damage and not look at the popularity, then Fire Mage would also be joining this group of DPS. That seems to have been more or less unchanged since last week, besides the buff given to Fire Mage and the growth of Fire Mage as a spec in the raid. But for a second, let's just touch on balance. No, I'm not talking about balance through it, nobody cares. About the actual positions in, you know, all of these tier lists, all of these rankings, because if you're first or if you're last often depends on how much of a gap there is. Because, you know, I could ask you, would you rather be last but only 5% behind the top? Or would you rather be in the middle but, you know, 15% behind the S tier specs? So in this case, when it comes to the DPS, so far in this first couple of weeks of the Mythic difficulty, you can see that at the very bottom, you know, excluding Augmentation Evoker, at the very bottom, this bottom tier of DPS is averaging 1.95 million DPS, whereas the very high end, almost getting into the S tier, is getting to, you know, 1.170 more or less, right? The very entry level to the S tier. So basically, the gap between this bottom and this top is about 80,000 DPS. This means that if your damage at the top is 1.2 million, 80,000 DPS, we are talking about 7 to 8% damage. So, you know, this gap is about 7 to 8% damage. It's also more visible here as well, where Shadow Priest is at like the median of 69 and Fire Mage is at a median of 78. So it's an 8-point difference between the top and the bottom, which is very good. You know, even if it looks terrible to see, for example, Windwalker here and over, you know, Frost here, meaning that Frost is totally the S tier spec and Windwalker is shit. Actually, it's not. This is a difference that can be easily fixed by just having a couple more item levels over the other one, having better trinkets over the other one, and also for once just being a better player. You know, at this level, with this few percentages of difference when it comes to the DPS, none of this matters too much. You will be able to find, and I'm sure you have seen it yourself in your own raids, plenty of Windwalker Monks topping the meters, plenty of Devastation Evokers topping the meters, or Elemental Shamans topping the meters. Because the difference right now between the top and the bottom is actually very balanced, even if we are at the very, you know, early release of this tier. So Blizzard has been able to keep the specs reasonably close. You will have, of course, bigger outliers if you move over, for example, to pure single target damage. Some specs will be significantly worse. So in this case, for example, the median goes up to almost 15 points instead of 8 between the best in single target and the worst in single target. When it comes to overall damage, it seems to be a pretty even spread at the moment. We are, of course, getting some changes in the results, as we point out every week at the release of a tier. These results, because they are overall results, are going to change the more logs we get of the deeper bosses. Right now there are no logs of these. Last week we had no logs of Broad Twister. Now we have been getting more logs of Broad Twister, even though right now we're still talking about like 5 guilds logging this. But as you can see, because Frost and Unholy and even Fury and Elemental are doing very well on Broad Twister, when you go back to the overall damage, Frost, Unholy and Fury Warrior will gain more because of being good on Broad Twister for now. Then maybe in a couple of weeks more logs of Nexus Princess will come out. Nexus Princess is pure single target damage. Some of these packs will be doing better in single target, so they will increase their overall results. So we are far from being done with this tier. Also, Also, don't forget that ultimately what will shape the importance of this damage mostly will be who is best on Ansurek. So technically speaking, just to make an example, if Arcane Mage is better, the better spec from Olgrax to Silken Court, Frost Mage is clearly stronger on Ansurek, then you will be gearing, speccing, talenting, enchanting and trinketing in the prospective idea of playing Frost for Ansurek. It won't matter that Arcane will be for these 3 to 4 weeks the best spec in these bosses being logged if Frost will be the stronger here. So we're not here yet, we're not here yet. We've only seen the world first guilds. Also, by the time more guilds will get to this boss, the anniversary patch will have launched, which means we have more balance tuning for many more specs, so many more things will change when it comes to balancing for the DPS. That's the situation right now when it comes to DPS. What we mentioned last week actually is still true today, that the most unique thing about this release of the season wasn't actually in the DPS. As we have seen here, they are pretty even. The gap between the DPS specs from top to bottom isn't very large at all. What was more interesting was the gap when it came to healers. Now, Preservation has just been nerfed. I don't think it showed in here. I think it was just the hotfix about the power of Consume Flame affecting double versatility, etc, etc, but it was still supposedly nerfed. However, as we can see, the result is still quite high. It looks also like Preservation Evokers are getting better, because it is likely that many of these ones are just flavor of the month rerollers without much of an idea of how to play the spec. Now that they are getting better at the spec, they are getting even better results. We even have now, with Evokers getting better, the average results of Preservation being better than the average upper quartile results of every other spec. You see here, Evoker is at 78 points median, Holy Paladin is at 76, upper quartile, 75 for Shaman, 74 for Windwalker, 74 for Mistweaver, etc, etc. So yes, the performance advantage, the gap is still enormous in favor of Preservation. There will be, yes, also more changes to the spec. Actually, I shouldn't say the spec, to invoke fear in the Preservation Evokers playing Chrono Warden, for example, in Mythic class. If there are going to be nerfs, it's going to be in Flame Shaper, which is the hero talent that you see here. This is Flame Shaper, so that's what's going to be nerfed. Now, you can also see reflected in this how last minute this was, because look at the power that you see here on the screen of Preservation, and then look at the popularity. Preservation is losing to even Holy Priest, like it's losing to this. In which world would you think this would happen if people knew ahead of time how powerful Preservation would have been? The result is that simply there weren't that many Preservation Evokers to begin with, and even after it was discovered it was this strong, there just weren't that many. Some guilds, the top guilds, the ones that were running splits, so they had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters, many of those healers also had a Preservation Evoker, so they could easily swap to playing Preservation, but all of the other players, the more average players in the more normal guilds, they only had one character. Maybe at best they had a second one, but it ended up not being Preservation. So even with this incredible power, their popularity is just literally mid. Literally, they are the gatekeeper from the very underplayed specs, which is Resto, Mistweaver, and Discipline. And then they are losing to Holy Priest, to Holy Paladin, and then the winner right now being Restoration Shaman in the raid. So that's the current results right now. If anything, you could say the opposite. Players expected Resto Shaman to be the best one, which is why you have so many Shamans. You don't even have the excuse of the raid buff, because there are plenty of Enhancement Shamans and Elemental Shamans in the raid, so you're still getting that brought by the DPS. It's just way more healers were planning on playing Resto Shaman, so the numbers are still very high. It's not that their performance is that weak, by the way, it's still quite good. Nowhere close though to Preservation. So with these results, of course, whenever you check any attempts at rankings, of course, Preservation is going to be in the S tier. Obviously, as you move in a average of popularity as well, Preservation just suddenly drops. right? You have this funny thing where preservation is gapping everyone in healing, but their popularity is not nearly as high. Same goes in here. Preservation will still be considered the strongest healer, the Flame Shaper version of Preservation Evoker. Now, we don't have too many things to talk about when it comes to tanks, because tanks, as we mentioned in the raid, nobody cares about tanks. So most of this will be just filling the spots you need most of the time for your raid buffs, or if you bring some kind of good utility. So in this case, it's mostly a race between Guardian Druid, Brewmaster Monk, and then Blood DK. Blood DK is your like default staple tank, and then you switch between Brewmaster and Guardian depending on the composition of your raid. Since right now, back to the DPS, since right now, of course, Balance Druid is tragic, Feral Druid is nothing special, and Restoration Druid is awful, you have multiple chances of playing Guardian. Mistweaver is also doing quite poorly, Windwalker is completely average, so you also have good chances of bringing a Brewmaster as your only monk buff in the raid as well. So currently, this is the situation right now when it comes to the raid 2 weeks in. As mentioned, multiple things can still be bound to change, not just because of the tuning that just happened. This wasn't actually that major, this was just okay, but because we have the anniversary patch supposedly coming at the end of October, that will also bring a lot of changes. Scaling is still a thing. Yes, players have gotten most of their power by now because they have their tier set. Many of them by now got their, hopefully, their trinkets from Mythic Plus, so they have their stuff, but they are still around 620-ish item level. The max item level in this season will be 637, 638. So we are still missing some 15 plus item levels, which is well over 20% of your damage missing, basically. So there might be some changes based on how many more secondary stats you can get for some of these specs. More likely, most of the changes will come, though, from any further balance tuning, plus the class changes planned for the anniversary patch coming in a few weeks. But for today, this is the, I guess, what's this? Wednesday? Yeah, Wednesday recap of what's been going down in the raid up to, well, last week, last reset. So for today, with a reminder that likely as you're watching this video, we are live streaming as well. You can come and join tonight, I guess, in EU, and this afternoon in NA. Besides this, we are now leaving each other on this Wednesday. Thanks, of course, everyone for watching, together with who is supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, that's my... how do you call this? This ringy thing to put in your hair in English? I actually don't know.